that Trump considers the entire Western Hemisphere to be part of the American empire. So there's a Trump corollary to the moral doctrine in the naval assets assembled in the Caribbean. About 10% of all America's naval assets is to enforce the mineral doctrine. So basically the idea is that a Trump believes that Russia and China have coached too deeply into South America. Russia has the security arrangements with Cuba. China has some investment and trade arrangements with the entirety of Latin and South America. China has about 30 portos in South America. It imports 1/3 of its food from South America, especially Brazil, which provides most of its soybeans. China's building a mega port in Peru. So this escalation with Venezuela, it's really to show the world that America can enforce a mineral doctrine, and it's really to disrupt as much as possible China's burgeoning relationship with South America. What he's outlining here is a modern version of empire logic, the idea that the Western Hemisphere still belongs exclusively to Washington. The naval buildup in the Caribbean isn't really about Venezuela. It's about sending a signal to China and Russia. Beijing's ports, trade routes, and food supply chains across South America represent influence the U.S. can't control economically anymore. So pressure replaces persuasion. That's the real escalation. In 2026, President Xi and President Trump are scheduled to meet 4 times. The big event will be when Trump visits China on a state visit in April. So these 4 meetings, they need to hash out an agreement, a new economic relationship for the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm in the late 90s when China and America was negotiating WTO entry. Basically, the idea was that over time China would liberalize its financial markets and China would become more economically integrated with America, meaning that Chinese consumers would buy more products from America. But over time, from the American perspective, this relationship has become much more lopsided. And so America really wants China to liberalize its financial markets, basically open the door for Wall Street to come in and start giving easy credit to Chinese consumers. The very idea behind this is that America feels that the American consumer has maxed out on their credit cards, and now it's time for the Chinese consumer to support the global economy by consuming more things. The problem is that the Chinese economy itself faces a lot of headwinds. And quite honestly, the Chinese consumer is not that optimistic about the future, and therefore they don't want to spend that much money. So this Venezuela conflict is actually part of a much bigger conflict between China and America. America basically wants to say to China, you either liberalize your markets or we will embargo you. Okay, so this Venezuela, it's basically a litmus test to see how far America can go and to see what the Chinese response will be. This puts Venezuela in a much bigger frame. What's really being negotiated here isn't ideology, it's consumption. Washington wants China to open its financial system and absorb global demand. The American consumer no longer can. Beijing isn't buying that future, literally or economically. So pressure replaces negotiation. Venezuela becomes a test case how far the U.S. can push and how China chooses to respond. Right now, China is a closed financial market. There's a lot of financial repression going on in China. So the idea is that right now, the United States is $38 trillion in debt. It's a great Ponzi scheme, and the only way to keep this Ponzi scheme keep on rolling is more and more people buy U.S. dollars. And so the great hope is that the Chinese consumer can save the Ponzi scheme that is a U.S. financial market. But you're absolutely right. So why would China agree to such a deal? China is self-sufficient. The Chinese Government has guaranteed a very high standard of living for the Chinese citizen. And the great fear is that if there's stabilization going on, then China could have received too much easy credit like Japan did in the late 80s and early 90s of passports, right? And this really basically diluted the Chinese the Japanese manufacturing power. So that's a great fear, and so China doesn't really want to liberalize its financial markets. And that's why America is applying pressure everywhere, especially in Venezuela. This is where the financial reality becomes uncomfortable. The U.S. system depends on constant demand for dollars to keep its debt model alive. Washington's hope is that Chinese consumers step in where Americans can't anymore. But Beijing remembers Japan, easy credit, financial liberalization, and long-term industrial decline. China doesn't want that trap, and that refusal is why pressure shows up everywhere else, including Venezuela. This trade war has been going on for about 8 years now. China is probably willing to negotiate with the United States, but the United States has been a bully. So, the United States has imposed tariffs unilaterally, which forced China to respond. The United States has limited a technology to China. Basically, it forced China to develop its own semiconductor industry. And then there was an incident where the Huawei executive Mongol was arrested and essentially detained for a number of years before she was finally released. The United States has been a bully to China. And you're absolutely right that China will be perfectly happy to sit down as equals and negotiate a fair agreement for which everyone benefits. But the United States doesn't behave like that. The United States is an imperial bully. This trade war has lasted years because it wasn't handled as a negotiation. Tariffs, tech bans, and pressure forced China to adapt, not submit. Beijing isn't against talks. It's against being treated like a subordinate. So for the past 10 years, China has developed a very strong relationship with South America. So before in the 60s and 70s, United States would go in and install these dictators that essentially bankrupt their regimes. These South American elite would steal resources and then transfer these resources to America. China plays a different game. China's very focused on long-term economic stability. So it's building roads, it's building high-SPE speed rails, it's building ports for the South American countries, which is helping them develop economically. China is very intent on establishing a win-win economic relationship. So they get a lot of food and energy from South America. So China is really interested in developing a long-term relationship. And the South Americans love this. And so this rattles America, right? Because America sees South America as its backyard. So it's really about soft power. It's really about perception. And the great fear is that if China is allowed to do what it wants in South America, eventually South America will turn against America, and America will find itself isolated from a South America. And so it's not just about Venezuela oil. It's really about all the resources of South America. Now, as everyone knows, South America contains a lot of resources. It has something called the lithium triangle, which is Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And they together hold about 50% of the world's lithium, which is crucial for EVs, from AI for batteries. So South America is a crucial battleground between China and the United States. This explains why South America matters so much. China built influence through roads, ports, and long-term trade, not coups or client dictators. That shift scares Washington because soft power lasts longer than force. This isn't just about Venezuela or oil. It's about resources, lithium, and who shapes the future of an entire continent. Israel doesn't necessarily want a war with Iran. Israel wants a war between United States and Iran because Israel cannot defeat Iran, and we know this. From a 12-day war where Iran was raining ballistic missiles on us on Israel, so Israel's vaunted air defense system on the Iron Dome, the Sling of David, it did not hold up against these Iranian hypersonics. And the Iranians already said that they were not using their full capacity. So Israel does not want a full-scale war of Iran. This is a crucial distinction. Israel doesn't want a direct war with Iran. It wants Washington to fight it instead. The missile exchanges already exposed the limits of Israel's defenses. That reality explains the push to internationalize the conflict rather than face it alone, because Israel would most likely lose in this scenario. So what Israel wants, ideally, is for America to be dragged into a war with Iran. So Israel needs to finagle things in that to force Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz. And this would compel an American invasion to protect global trade. And I think that's the most likely scenario. If America is defeated and Iran is shattered, then there's no other power in the Middle East to resist Israel. Now I understand, like the geopolitics of the Middle East, it's very complicated. But for the past 10, 20 years, Israel has been doing whatever it wanted without any resistance. So if the Americans were to leave, Israel would become the de facto power, and there's very little that the GCC could do to stop Israel. What do you think stops or prevents Israel from launching nukes at Iran? Well, I mean, the problem when you launch nukes is you break the taboo. So, if you launch nukes, everyone else can launch nukes. So I think there's a global taboo where you're not allowed to use nukes, and I think like we've built a lot of institutions to support this taboo. So I saw Israel use as an option, which is say, like if we're threatened, we'll use nukes, otherwise it doesn't make sense for them to use tactical nukes in a war because they're still a smaller nation. So Iran is mountainous. If you use your nuclear weapons against Iran and you exhaust your nuclear weapons, it's still going to stand. But Israel is a desert. So 1 or 2 nuclear weapons can wipe out their 9 million population. So it's not something that Israel wants to find itself in. It's not a situation that Israel wants to find itself in a nuclear exchange. It's going to lose in this exchange. So, and Israel doesn't need to use nuclear weapons. It's again such an option is like if the existence of Israel is threatened, then they will nuke the world, but only if the existence of Israel is threatened will they do that. The logic here is escalation by proxy. Israel knows a direct war with Iran is unwinnable. So the incentive is to internationalize the conflict. Forcing a crisis at the Strait of Hormuz would almost guarantee U.S. involvement. Nuclear weapons aren't a real option. Deterrence cuts both ways. This isn't about conquest. It's about survival through escalation management. I think that Iran has been preparing for about 20 years for this fight. In the 1980s, the Iran fought this kind of cataclysmic war with Iraq where lost millions of people. But it really built a can-do mentality in Iran. And then Iranians saw what America did in 2003 in Iraq. Then it saw what America did in Libya and Syria. So Iran knows that it's that America is going to come for it eventually. Wesley Clark after 9/11, he did, on talking to Amy Goodman, he did say that he saw some kind of confidential documents saying that America will go after 7 nations. There's only 1 nation left on that list, and it's Iran, right? They got Sudan, they got them, Syria. So I can't remember every nation, but the only nation left on that list is Iran. So it's part of the plan. Americans should come to Iran, and Iran's been preparing for the past 20 years. And the preparation is in drones, and in hypersonics and ballistic missiles. And the reason why is that America will always win conventional warfare against Iran. So, the only way to defeat America is to drag America into Iran and then use asymmetrical guerrilla warfare to disrupt supply lines and stop the morale of the American soldier. And America doesn't have the manufacturing capacity. It doesn't have the personnel to win a war against Iran. America will go into Iran, thinking that it'll be another Iraq. Well, they do shock on all for 2 weeks, and then the regime will be toppled, and then they can install whoever they want in Tan. And I think they're going to be surprised when the opposite happens, when Shah rallies and unifies the Iranian people against the American empire. This didn't start yesterday. Iran has spent 2 decades preparing for the possibility of confrontation shaped by Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Iran understands it can't win a conventional war against the United States. So it prepared asymmetrically: drones, missiles, terrain, and endurance. History shows this pattern clearly. Shock campaigns can topple regimes, but they can also unify nations. And that's the risk Washington keeps underestimating.